The sound of footsteps echoed down the marble hallway as a young boy walked nervously toward the courtroom doors. His suit looked slightly too big for him, the sleeves brushing against his hands as he clutched a stack of papers. People turned to look at him, whispering to each other, trying to guess why someone his age was even there. He couldn't have been older than 17. His face was calm, but his eyes told a story of someone who'd seen more than his years suggested. When he pushed the heavy wooden doors open, a wave of chatter filled the air. The courtroom was busy that morning. Lawyers in dark coats shuffled papers. A few police officers stood near the back, and family members of both sides filled the benches. The boy hesitated for just a second before taking a deep breath and walking forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and silver hair tied neatly behind her head, noticed him immediately. She leaned toward the clerk and asked in a low voice, "Who's that boy? Is he here for traffic court or something?" The clerk shook his head, glancing at the case file. "No, Your Honor. He's listed as a representative for the defense in the Walker hearing." The judge frowned. "Representative? He's a child. Where is the defense attorney?" "He's standing right there, Your Honor." Her eyes widened slightly. "That's impossible," she said under her breath. But the name was right there on the docket. Ethan Walker, Youth Legal Assistant, appearing under mentorship supervision. She sighed, already annoyed. "Fine," she muttered. "Let's see how this circus goes." Ethan found his seat at the defense table, his movements careful, polite, practiced. He placed his papers down, adjusted his tie, though it was slightly crooked, and looked up at the judge with respect. The opposing attorney, a tall man with a loud voice and an expensive watch, looked at him and chuckled. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered to his assistant. "We're letting kids play lawyer now?" The audience began to murmur again. A few people even laughed quietly. To them, the boy looked like he was in the wrong place. Maybe he'd gotten lost on his way to a school field trip. He didn't fit the picture of someone who belonged there, surrounded by adults in suits and legal documents piled high. The judge banged her gavel, silencing the room. "Let's begin. Case number 417 in B, State v. Rivers. The defense will identify themselves for the record." Ethan stood, trying not to let his hands shake. "Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm appearing as a certified youth legal assistant under the mentorship of Attorney Harris. I'll be representing the defense's preparatory case today." The judge stared at him for a moment, almost in disbelief. "Mr. Walker," she began slowly, "how old are you?" "I'm 17, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted with quiet laughter again. The judge raised an eyebrow. 17. And you think you can stand in this court and represent a case? This is a serious criminal hearing, not a school debate." Ethan swallowed hard, but his voice didn't tremble. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand the seriousness of this case. I'm not here to replace counsel, just to present the motion and evidence that I've prepared with my supervising attorney." The judge sighed and looked over at the prosecution. "Do you have any objections to this arrangement?" The prosecutor smirked. "No objections, Your Honor. I think we can all use a little entertainment today." A few people chuckled again. Ethan didn't look up. He just placed his papers neatly on the table, adjusted his notes, and prepared for what would come next. The hearing began with the usual formalities, the reading of the charges, the confirmation of attendance, and the listing of evidence submissions. Ethan listened carefully, jotting down small notes in the margins of his papers. His handwriting was small but fast and sharp, every line written with purpose. The judge, though irritated, couldn't help but notice the boy's calmness. Most people that age would be sweating or stumbling over their words. Ethan wasn't smiling, but his eyes were steady, focused. When she called for the defense to respond, he rose slowly and addressed the court again. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "before proceeding with testimonies, I'd like to make a preliminary motion regarding the chain of evidence." The prosecutor leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Of course you would," he muttered sarcastically. The judge waved a hand. "Proceed, Mr. Walker. Let's hear this motion." Ethan stepped forward, opening his folder. The defense moves to dismiss Exhibit C as invalid evidence due to improper handling between the date of collection and the date of submission. The chain of custody log shows an unexplained 12-hour gap between Officer Miller's seizure report and the evidence intake record, according to local procedural law. Any break exceeding 6 hours must be accompanied by a supplemental affidavit. No such affidavit was provided. The courtroom went quiet. The judge blinked, slightly surprised. That was not something she expected from a teenager. The prosecutor frowned and began flipping through his own papers. "That can't be right," he said, whispering to his assistant. But it was. The record did have a gap. The judge leaned forward. "How did you catch that?" Ethan looked up. "I reviewed all 82 pages of the evidence report last night, Your Honor." The discrepancy stood out. "I confirmed it by cross-checking the timestamps." A few people in the audience exchanged looks. The earlier laughter had stopped. The prosecutor's confident expression faded a little. The judge cleared her throat. "Well, let me see the report." She examined the pages for a moment, her brow furrowing. "He's correct," she said finally. "There is a gap." The prosecutor stood quickly. "Your Honor, that's a minor clerical issue. It doesn't invalidate the evidence." "On the contrary," Ethan interrupted, his tone respectful but firm. "The law is clear on this point. Without a verified affidavit, the chain is considered broken, and the integrity of the evidence cannot be guaranteed." The judge looked between the two of them, clearly weighing her options. "All right," she said. "I'll reserve judgment on that motion until later in the hearing. Continue." Ethan sat back down, his heart pounding in his chest. His palms were damp, but he didn't show it. He could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, but he focused on his notes again. The prosecutor glanced at him, no longer laughing. For the next half hour, the court went through the procedural parts of the hearing. Ethan didn't speak much, only taking notes, occasionally whispering to the family he was representing. They looked at him with quiet hope, their nerves easing slightly. They trusted him, maybe not because he was a lawyer, but because he cared. When the break was called, Ethan stepped outside into the hallway. He exhaled deeply, finally letting the pressure escape his chest. He leaned against the wall, staring at the floor, feeling the rush of adrenaline fade away. A woman approached him, the defendant's mother. Her eyes were tired, her hands trembling slightly as she held her purse. "You did good in there," she said softly. "They were laughing at you, but you showed them." "You really showed them?" Ethan smiled faintly. "It's not over yet," he said. "But thank you." "You're just a kid," she said, shaking her head. "And yet you know all that law talk better than those men in suits." "How do you do it?" He looked away, his voice quiet. "I just study a lot. I read case files like they're stories. Every mistake in a file tells you something about the people behind it. I like to find those details," she smiled weakly. "You're something special, you know that?" Ethan didn't answer. He looked through the window at the courthouse garden outside. For a moment he seemed far away, lost in thought. When the break ended, he went back inside, calmer than before. The judge returned to the bench, her expression unreadable. "All right," she said. "Let's continue." This time, as Ethan walked back to his seat, the laughter was gone. The room was quiet. People watched him differently, not as a joke, but as someone who might actually know what he was doing. Still, the judge wasn't convinced. She leaned forward. "Mr. Walker," she said sternly, "you've surprised me today. But don't think for a moment that clever memorization will carry you through a full hearing. You're dealing with real lives here, not theory." Ethan nodded. "I understand, Your Honor." "Good," she said, "because I'll be watching you very closely." The rest of the session passed with slow tension. The prosecutor seemed more cautious now, double-checking his papers before speaking. The judge occasionally glanced at Ethan, her earlier irritation replaced with something else. Curiosity, maybe even a trace of respect. When the gavel finally struck to adjourn for the day, Ethan gathered his papers quietly. He didn't smile or celebrate. He just exhaled and whispered to himself, one step at a time. As he left the courtroom, a few people nodded at him, not mockingly this time, but with quiet acknowledgement. The same crowd that had laughed when he walked in now stepped aside to let him pass. Outside, the sun was already setting. The courthouse cast long shadows across the pavement. Ethan stopped for a moment, looking back at the building. It had been the hardest day of his life so far, but also the first time anyone in that world had truly seen him. He walked down the steps slowly, the weight of the day heavy on his shoulders, but his heart light with determination. He knew it wasn't over. The judge didn't trust him yet. The prosecutor certainly didn't. But deep down he felt something shift. The laughter had turned into silence, and that silence meant he'd earned their attention. Tomorrow he'd have to earn their respect. The next morning, the courtroom was already full when Ethan arrived. The heavy air of judgment hung in the room like fog. People were whispering again, but the tone had changed. Some were curious, others skeptical. The story of a teenager speaking in court had already spread through the courthouse like wildfire. Clerks, lawyers, and even officers from other departments had shown up to see it for themselves. Ethan took his place at the defense table, quietly unpacking his files. His suit was pressed, his notes carefully organized, and yet his hands trembled just a little as he straightened the papers. He'd spent the night reviewing every section of the case file, barely sleeping. He wanted to make sure there would be no mistakes, no hesitation. He knew he was still being judged, not for what he'd done, but for who he was. The door behind the bench opened and Judge Clarkson entered, her robe flowing as she walked to her seat. The courtroom stood, and for a brief moment her eyes met Ethan's. There was no smile, no warmth, just a cautious look that said she hadn't forgotten the day before. When everyone sat down, she shuffled her papers and said flatly, "Let's resume." The prosecutor was already smirking. He adjusted his tie and leaned over to his assistant. "Let's see how long the kid lasts today," he whispered. Ethan heard it but didn't react. He had learned early that silence was often more powerful than words. The judge called the case, and soon the courtroom settled into its rhythm again. The first witness was called, an officer who had handled one of the evidence items Ethan had questioned the previous day. The man walked to the stand confidently, ready to defend his work. "Officer, can you confirm the chain of custody for Exhibit C?" the prosecutor asked, his tone overly casual as though setting up a trap. "Yes," the officer said. "I handled the evidence personally from the scene to the station." Ethan made a note, then looked up. When it was his turn to question the witness, he stood slowly. "Good morning, officer," he said, keeping his tone polite. "You mentioned you handled the evidence personally. Could you remind the court of the exact times recorded in your report?" The officer blinked. Around 8:30 p.m. when it was collected and logged by the next morning." "So there was a gap overnight?" Ethan asked gently. "Yes, I suppose so." "Was there an affidavit filed to explain that gap?" The officer hesitated. "No, not that I'm aware of." Ethan nodded slightly, his face calm. "Thank you, officer. That's all." He sat down and the courtroom was silent again. The judge glanced toward the prosecutor, who was clearly uncomfortable. "Do you have a response?" she asked. "Just that it's a technical issue, Your Honor," he replied stiffly. "The evidence remains valid." "Maybe," the judge said, "but the defense has raised a valid concern. I'll take it under advisement." Ethan said nothing. He just wrote another note in his folder. He could feel eyes on him again, some in disbelief, some in quiet respect. He wasn't trying to show off. He was just trying to be heard. When the recess was called, Ethan walked into the hallway again. This time, a few reporters had gathered. Word had spread that a teenager was arguing in a real courtroom, and people wanted to know more. Cameras clicked. Someone asked loudly, "Kid, who trained you? Are you really a lawyer?" He didn't answer. He didn't want attention, only fairness for the family he was helping. The prosecutor stepped out moments later, brushing past him. "Enjoy the show while it lasts," he said coldly. "You might know a few laws, but this isn't a classroom. You'll make one mistake and that'll be the end of your little act." Ethan didn't look up. "Maybe," he said quietly, "but it won't be today." The man scoffed and walked away. Ethan let out a long breath and looked at his reflection in the courthouse glass wall. He looked like a boy pretending to be an adult, but deep inside he felt something shift. He wasn't pretending. He belonged here, even if no one else believed it yet. When court resumed, the judge began asking tougher questions. She questioned Ethan's understanding of certain precedents, clearly testing him. He answered each one carefully, never rushing, quoting rules and examples he'd studied for months. She hid her surprise well, but the slight lift of her eyebrow gave her away. "Mr. Walker," she said finally, "where did you learn all this?" He hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Mostly from reading, Your Honor. I spend a lot of time studying legal archives and watching open court sessions. I also volunteer at the Community Legal Center." The judge nodded slightly, though her tone remained firm. "You realize this isn't a place for experiments, don't you?" "Yes, Your Honor, I know," he said softly. That's why I'm taking it seriously. She didn't reply. Instead, she called for the next witness. The afternoon dragged on. Ethan could feel exhaustion creeping in, but he refused to let it show. Every detail mattered. Every sentence could change the outcome. When the opposing counsel tried to corner him on a procedural rule, Ethan calmly cited the exact section and explained its meaning, leaving the prosecutor silent for a few seconds before moving on awkwardly. By the time the session ended, the tone in the room had changed again. There was less laughter now, more quiet conversation. The reporters who had come expecting a funny story were suddenly scribbling notes. One of them whispered to another, "This kid's not a joke. He's actually winning ground." When the judge adjourned, Ethan packed up his notes carefully. As he turned to leave, the clerk approached him. "Mr. Walker," she said quietly, "the judge wants to see you in chambers for a moment." Ethan froze. "Am I in trouble?" The clerk smiled faintly. "No, not that I know of. Just come." He followed her down a narrow hallway lined with old portraits of judges. Each face seemed to stare at him, heavy with history and authority. When they reached the door, the clerk opened it and gestured him inside. Judge Clarkson was seated behind her desk, glasses resting on the bridge of her nose. She looked up as he entered. "Sit down, Mr. Walker." Ethan did as told, clutching his folder on his lap. She studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You're an unusual young man," she said finally. "I've seen law students crumble under far less pressure. You seem to thrive on it." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. She leaned back. "But you're still a teenager. You're not licensed, and every time you speak in my courtroom, you put both your reputation and someone else's case on the line. Do you understand how serious that is?" "Yes, Your Honor," he said softly. "That's why I prepare so much. I don't want to make mistakes." There was a long silence. The judge finally sighed. "Why are you doing this? Most kids your age are worried about school dances and exams. What makes you want to stand in courtrooms?" Ethan looked down at his hands. "Because I hate seeing people get ignored," he said. "When I was little, my mom had a case. She didn't have a lawyer who cared. She lost everything because no one paid attention to the details. I told myself that when I grew up, I'd learn how the system worked so I could stop that from happening to other people." For the first time, the judge's expression softened. She looked at him not as a boy playing dress-up, but as someone carrying something heavy. "You've got a strong heart," she said quietly. "But heart alone isn't enough. The law is built on patience, discipline, and humility." "I understand," Ethan replied. "I'm trying to learn all of that." She nodded slowly, then waved her hand. "All right, go on. We'll continue tomorrow." He stood and thanked her before leaving. The clerk smiled faintly as he passed. Outside, the hallway was empty now. The courthouse felt quiet, the echoes of footsteps fading into the distance. He walked down the steps into the cold evening air, the sky painted orange by the setting sun. For a moment he stopped and looked up at the courthouse again. He knew tomorrow would be harder. The prosecutor would fight harder, the judge would test him again, and people would keep doubting him. But that didn't scare him anymore. The laughter from the first day was gone. Now there was silence, the kind that meant people were paying attention. He smiled faintly to himself and whispered, "One step closer." Then he walked away into the fading light, ready for whatever came next. By the third day, the courtroom was filled to the edges. The story of the young representative had reached beyond the courthouse walls. People from nearby offices, students from the law school, and even a few local reporters came early just to get a seat. Some came to cheer him on. Others came just to see if he would finally stumble. Either way, all eyes were on the boy who had somehow turned a simple hearing into a public spectacle. Ethan arrived quietly, carrying his usual folder, his face calm but focused. He didn't notice the murmurs that followed him through the doors. He was used to them now. Every day he had walked into that courtroom, people had doubted him. Every day he had walked out proving something new. But today felt different. Today, the case had reached its breaking point, and he knew that one wrong word could undo everything he had worked for. The judge entered, as usual, with her steady steps and unreadable expression. "Good morning," she said in her formal tone. "Let's proceed." The prosecutor looked unusually confident. He had prepared something, that much was clear. His smile was wide, his posture straight, as if he had been waiting for this day to take the young man down a notch. "Your Honor," he began, "the state wishes to introduce a key witness and finalize the presentation of evidence." The judge nodded. "Proceed." Ethan sat silently, listening carefully. The witness was the property owner connected to the case. The prosecutor asked routine questions, establishing background facts. But something in the man's answers caught Ethan's attention. He leaned closer, flipping through his notes quickly, his pen tapping lightly against the folder. There was an inconsistency, a small one but important. The witness claimed to have been out of town when the incident occurred, yet the earlier statements listed him as the one who called the police that night. Ethan's heart began to beat faster. That contradiction could change everything. When the prosecutor finished, he turned toward Ethan with a sly grin. "Your turn, Mr. Walker. Let's see what the prodigy has for us today." Ethan stood up, adjusting his slightly wrinkled jacket. He walked to the front of the courtroom with quiet confidence, his papers in one hand. He looked at the witness and said in a steady voice, "Good morning, sir. I just have a few questions." The man on the stand nodded, clearly underestimating him. "Go ahead, son," Ethan smiled politely. "You mentioned earlier that you were out of town on the night of the 12th, correct?" "Yes," the man replied. "I was visiting relatives." "And yet," Ethan said, glancing at his paper, "in your initial statement to the police, you're listed as the person who called in the disturbance at 9:42 p.m. that same night. Can you explain how that happened?" The man's confident smile faltered. The room went quiet again. The prosecutor shifted in his chair. The judge looked up, interested. I might have been mistaken," the witness stammered. "Maybe my brother called," Ethan nodded. "I see, but your brother's name doesn't appear anywhere on the report. Would you like to see a copy of the call log?" The man hesitated. "No, that's fine." Ethan handed the document to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. "For the record, Your Honor, this call originated from the witness's registered phone number. The timestamp places him in town, less than a mile from the scene." The prosecutor jumped to his feet. "Objection. He's misinterpreting the record." The judge raised a hand. "Overruled." "I'll allow it," Ethan continued, his tone calm but firm. "Sir, were you present at the property that night?" The man's hands twitched. I might have stopped by, but only briefly." "Did you enter the property?" "I don't remember." "Did you see my client that evening?" The witness looked down. "Maybe." Ethan paused, letting the silence stretch. Then he said softly, "So you weren't out of town?" "You were there, weren't you?" The man swallowed hard. "I suppose I was nearby." Gasps filled the room. Even the prosecutor froze for a second before trying to recover. "Your Honor, this line of questioning is irrelevant." The judge shook her head. "On the contrary, it's very relevant." Ethan stepped back slightly, lowering his voice. "No further questions, Your Honor." As he returned to his seat, the air in the room shifted. The spectators whispered to one another, the tension breaking like a wave. Even the judge looked impressed, though she hid it behind her professional mask. The prosecutor tried to regain control, calling for a short recess. But everyone knew what had just happened. Ethan had caught a major inconsistency, and it had weakened the prosecution's case in front of everyone. During the break, Ethan sat alone in the corner of the hallway, drinking from a paper cup of water. His hands were steady now. He wasn't nervous anymore. He could still hear the faint chatter of people outside the courtroom. Some were praising him, others doubting him, but all of them were talking about him. A clerk passing by stopped and said quietly, "Nice work in there. You made him look like he was hiding something." Ethan smiled faintly. "Thank you. I just did what I was supposed to do." When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere was different. The judge looked more attentive. The prosecutor seemed slightly rattled. Ethan could sense the change and decided it was time to present the motion he had been preparing all night. "Your Honor," he began, standing once again, "I'd like to file a motion to suppress certain statements made by the prosecution's witness, as they appear inconsistent with prior records. I also have reason to believe the state failed to disclose a secondary report that may contradict the testimony we just heard." The prosecutor objected immediately. "This is absurd." "He's fishing for attention." Ethan didn't flinch. "Then perhaps the state can clarify why the second report, dated 2 days later, contains a different timeline of events." The judge looked sharply at the prosecutor. "Is that true?" The man hesitated. It's an internal draft, Your Honor, not part of the official record. That's not the question, she said sternly. Does it exist? He sighed. Yes. Then it should have been disclosed, she said firmly. I'll allow the motion. Ethan nodded respectfully and sat down. The prosecutor glared at him, but Ethan didn't meet his eyes. He didn't need to. The facts were already speaking louder than anything else. The rest of the day moved slowly, filled with tense exchanges and detailed legal arguments. Ethan handled them all with patience and precision. His notes were covered in small scribbles, reminders, facts, numbers, but he seemed to keep every detail in his head. Each time he stood, the room quieted. Each time he spoke, the judge listened a little more closely. By late afternoon, the session was almost over. The judge leaned forward and said, Mr. Walker, before we close for the day, I want to commend your composure. Regardless of the outcome, you've conducted yourself with respect and professionalism. Ethan nodded. Thank you, Your Honor, that means a lot. She smiled faintly. Don't thank me yet. The law isn't kind to those who stop learning. I'll keep that in mind, he replied softly. As the gavel struck to end the hearing, the courtroom burst into quiet conversation again. Some clapped softly. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Ethan gathered his papers, moving slowly, aware of the stares but unfazed by them. The family he was helping thanked him with teary smiles, their hope a little stronger than before. Outside the courthouse, the evening air felt lighter. Reporters called out to him again, asking questions, but he kept walking. The sun was setting behind the courthouse dome, painting the sky gold. He paused at the top of the steps, watching the light fade, and allowed himself one small smile. He wasn't a lawyer yet. He didn't have a title or a degree, but for the first time it didn't matter. In that courtroom, among the whispers and doubts, he had found his voice, and people had listened. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new challenges. The prosecutor would fight harder, the judge would test him again, and more people would come to watch. But tonight, walking away with the quiet pride of having told the truth, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt before. Not victory, but belonging. The fourth day began with a gray sky and steady drizzle that soaked the courthouse steps. Ethan walked slowly, his coat collar turned up against the rain. The cold air stung his cheeks, but he didn't mind. His mind was somewhere else, replaying every word from yesterday's hearing. He'd done well, but the case was far from over. The hardest part, he knew, was still ahead, the closing arguments. Inside, the halls buzzed with quiet excitement. The case had become something of a spectacle. Even people with no stake in it came just to watch the young man who had turned a routine proceeding into a courtroom drama. Some believed in him, others waited for him to make a mistake. Either way, he couldn't let them see the doubt that sometimes crept into his own mind. When he entered the courtroom, the judge was already there, reading from a stack of documents. She looked up briefly, giving a small nod. The prosecutor sat across the room, his face tight, his confidence clearly bruised from the day before. He didn't look at Ethan, just kept whispering to his assistant and flipping through papers. The judge called the session to order. We'll continue where we left off. Mr. Walker, I understand you've submitted a new motion overnight? Yes, Your Honor, Ethan said, standing respectfully. I've included supporting evidence for the inconsistency found in the witness statements. I believe it changes the context of the property records and timeline. The prosecutor objected immediately, raising his hand. Your Honor, this is unnecessary. The defense representative has already stretched the limits of this court's patience. This evidence was not part of the initial submission. The judge shot him a sharp look. Watch your tone, counsel. The defense has a right to submit evidence that is relevant and properly sourced. Continue, Mr. Walker. Ethan took a breath, steadying his voice. This document, he said, holding it up, was filed a week after the incident but omitted from the final report. It shows that a security camera near the property was active that night, something the prosecution's report claimed didn't exist. The judge frowned slightly. Is that true? The prosecutor's lips tightened. Your Honor, that footage was deemed irrelevant. Ethan's voice remained calm. Respectfully, it's only irrelevant if it doesn't contradict the witness's testimony. The footage clearly shows someone entering the property at 9:37 p.m., which matches the time of the call. If the witness claimed he wasn't there, this footage proves otherwise, the courtroom murmured. The judge tapped her pen thoughtfully. I'll allow the evidence to be admitted. Ethan handed it to the clerk. He sat down again, his heart pounding though his face stayed composed. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a step closer. The truth was beginning to show through the cracks. The prosecutor tried to recover, but his voice carried a strain now. He called another witness to shift the focus, hoping to regain control. It was a technician who worked with the city records. Ethan listened carefully, taking notes as the man spoke about data handling, timestamps, and storage protocols. Every detail mattered. When it was his turn to cross-examine, Ethan stood up again. "Sir," he began politely, "you mentioned that the footage was copied to a central server before being archived. Who had access to that server?" "Only authorized personnel," the man said confidently. "And who authorizes access?" "The department supervisor." Ethan flipped through his folder. "Would that be the same supervisor who signed off on the missing affidavit from Exhibit C?" The witness blinked. I'm not sure." "That's all right," Ethan said calmly. "But the signatures look identical, don't they?" The technician leaned forward, squinting. "Yes, they do." "Thank you," Ethan said, nodding. No further questions. As he sat down, the prosecutor rubbed his forehead in frustration. The judge, meanwhile, was watching Ethan closely, not just with curiosity now, but something that resembled respect. She could see how much thought, how much care he had poured into every argument. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of testimonies and objections. Ethan kept his focus steady, catching every inconsistency, every moment of hesitation. The spectators could feel the shift. The teenager wasn't just surviving in the courtroom anymore. He was steering it. When the session finally broke for lunch, Ethan stepped outside and leaned against a pillar near the courthouse entrance. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still heavy and gray. He took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the exhaustion settle in. He hadn't eaten since early morning. His stomach growled, but he didn't move. He was too deep in thought. A voice interrupted his quiet moment. "You're making quite a name for yourself," someone said. Ethan opened his eyes to see a tall man in a neat gray suit. He looked older, maybe in his 40s, with kind but sharp eyes. "Name's Harold Finch," he said. "I'm with the City Bar Association." Ethan straightened, suddenly unsure. "Oh, hello, sir. I've been watching your case," Finch said. "You've got skill. Raw but real. Tell me, do you plan to take the bar exam someday?" Ethan nodded slowly. "That's the goal," Finch smiled. "Keep your head down and your work clean. People will test you, but don't give them a reason to doubt your integrity. You've got a gift. Don't waste it trying to prove anyone wrong. Just prove yourself right." Ethan absorbed the words quietly. "Thank you, sir." Finch gave him a nod before walking away. Ethan watched him go, feeling both humbled and inspired. He wasn't used to being encouraged by professionals. Most just laughed or ignored him. But that short exchange gave him a strange sense of belonging. When the afternoon session began, the judge's tone was different, lighter, more conversational. "Mr. Walker," she said, "before we proceed, I want to ensure you've reviewed the recent filings submitted by the prosecution." "I have, Your Honor," he said. "And I believe there's an inconsistency in their timeline." The prosecutor groaned quietly. "Of course he does." Ethan ignored the comment. He pointed to a section in the document. "Here it says the call came in at 9:42, but in the earlier record it was logged at 9:37. That 5-minute gap changes the witness's entire story." The judge looked intrigued. "Explain." "Because the video footage I submitted places him at the property at 9:37. If the call really happened at 9:42, then he couldn't have been out of town, as he said. The two records can't both be true." The judge turned to the prosecutor. "Care to respond?" The man hesitated. "It's a clerical error." Ethan didn't raise his voice. "A clerical error that perfectly matches the timeline of the footage?" The room went silent. Even the reporters stopped typing for a moment. The judge sighed. "That's enough for now. We'll review both records overnight. This court will reconvene tomorrow for closing arguments." Ethan sat back, relief washing over him. He'd done it. He had brought the truth to light piece by piece, without shouting, without grandstanding, just by paying attention. Something most people didn't expect a teenager to do. As the gavel struck, the courtroom began to empty. The family Ethan was representing walked up to him, their eyes filled with gratitude. "You gave us hope again," the woman said softly. No one else listened. "Thank you," he smiled shyly. "It's not over yet." But we're closer. When he finally stepped outside, the rain had stopped completely, and the first bit of sunlight peeked through the clouds. He paused on the courthouse steps, feeling the cool air brush his face. For the first time since the case began, he allowed himself a small smile. Tomorrow would be the final day. Tomorrow, he would face his biggest challenge yet. And maybe, just maybe, he would finally earn the respect he'd been chasing all along. The fifth day dawned brighter than any other. The storm that had hung over the city for days was finally gone, leaving the air crisp and clean. Sunlight streamed through the tall courthouse windows, giving everything a faint golden glow. It almost felt symbolic, like the clouds had cleared not just from the sky but from the case itself. Still, Ethan knew the calm could be deceiving. This was the day everything would be decided. He stood outside the courthouse earlier than anyone else. The steps were empty, the heavy wooden doors still closed. He stared at them for a while, feeling the weight of what was ahead. The final arguments. The moment where words would decide truth or failure. His palms were sweaty despite the chill, and for the first time since this whole thing began, he allowed himself to feel nervous. When the doors finally opened, he walked in slowly, clutching his worn folder close to his chest. Every note, every photograph, every small detail he'd uncovered, it was all inside that folder. It was his lifeline. The courtroom was quieter than usual. The reporters were still there, their cameras waiting, but even they seemed to sense something different. The tension was heavy but calm. The judge entered on time, her robe flowing behind her, her expression unreadable. The prosecutor looked tired, his once confident smirk now replaced with a wary glance toward Ethan. Everyone knew that today would end it all. "Court is now in session," the judge said, her voice echoing through the room. "We are here for closing arguments. Mr. Walker, you may proceed when ready." Ethan stood, his heart hammering, but his voice, when he finally spoke, was steady. "Thank you, Your Honor." He walked to the center of the courtroom, setting his folder down on the table. He didn't open it. He just looked at the people sitting before him, the family he was helping, the quiet faces in the audience, even the judge who had once doubted him. He began simply. "When this case started, no one believed me. Some thought I didn't belong here. Some laughed when they heard a teenager was trying to argue a case." He paused, letting his words settle. "But this was never about proving myself. It was about proving the truth." The courtroom was silent. Every eye was on him. He continued softly. "Over the past few days, we've seen evidence that was overlooked, statements that didn't match, and records that told a different story than the one presented. I'm not here to accuse anyone. I'm just asking the court to look, really look, at what's in front of us." He walked slowly toward the bench. The footage doesn't lie. The witness who claimed to be out of town was there. The call log places him near the scene. The timeline doesn't match the story the prosecution tried to build. And if even one piece of that story is false, how can we trust the rest? He stopped, his voice tightening just slightly. "My client has spent months being treated like a criminal for something he didn't do. He lost his job, his reputation, his peace, all because no one wanted to question what seemed convenient." He took a slow breath. "But justice isn't about convenience. It's about truth." The judge leaned forward slightly. Even the prosecutor was still, his eyes fixed on the floor. Ethan turned back toward the gallery, his tone softening again. "Your Honor, I'm not a lawyer, not yet. But I've spent every day learning what it means to defend someone. It means listening when others don't. It means standing up even when your voice shakes. It means believing that truth deserves a chance." He bowed his head slightly. "That's all I'm asking for today. A fair chance for the truth." When he returned to his seat, there was a long silence. The kind of silence that said everyone was thinking, weighing, feeling. The judge didn't speak right away. She just looked at him, as though seeing him differently now. Finally, she said quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Walker." The prosecutor stood slowly. He cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor, the defense's argument is emotional, but it's based on interpretation, not fact. The footage is unclear, and the timeline discrepancies are minor clerical issues. The evidence against the defendant remains strong." Ethan didn't interrupt. He sat still, listening closely. The prosecutor continued, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Every point he raised sounded thinner, weaker. When he finished, he sat down with a sigh. The judge took a long pause before speaking again. I've reviewed all the evidence, all the testimonies, and the additional material submitted. I'll reserve judgment until this afternoon. Court will recess for now. The gavel struck, and just like that, it was over, at least for the morning. Outside, Ethan sat on a bench near the courthouse steps, the late morning sun warming his face. The same reporters who used to mock him now hovered nearby, careful, waiting for a comment. He gave them nothing but a small nod. His mind was too full for interviews. The woman he was defending's mother sat beside him quietly. "You spoke beautifully in there," she said. "You made them listen." Ethan smiled faintly. "I hope it was enough." "It will be," she said with quiet certainty. "You reminded them what justice really means." He looked down at his hands. They were still shaking slightly. The adrenaline hadn't worn off. For the first time, he realized how much this case had taken out of him. The sleepless nights, the endless reading, the fear of being dismissed. But he also realized something else. He'd done what no one expected him to. He hadn't just defended someone. He'd stood for something bigger. When the court reconvened that afternoon, the atmosphere was tense again. Everyone was on edge. Even the air felt heavy. The judge returned to the bench with a stack of papers, her expression firm but calm. "Before I announce my decision," she began, "I want to address something important." Her gaze shifted to Ethan. "When this case began, I questioned whether you belonged in this courtroom. I questioned your preparation, your authority, and your understanding of the law. But over the past several days, you've shown not only skill and intellect, but also respect for the truth. This court acknowledges that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan didn't move. He just listened, his breath caught somewhere in his chest. The judge continued. "After reviewing all the evidence and testimony, it's clear there were significant inconsistencies in the prosecution's case. Therefore, the charges against the defendant are dismissed." The words hit the room like a wave. Gasps, murmurs, then a burst of quiet applause before the judge raised her hand for order. Ethan sat frozen for a moment, trying to process what he'd just heard. Then the family beside him began to cry, tears of relief, of joy. And only then did he allow himself to smile. The prosecutor lowered his head. The spectators whispered. But the judge wasn't finished. "And one more thing," she said, her tone softening. "Mr. Walker, I expect to see your name again, on a bar admission list someday. The legal world could use someone with your heart." Ethan stood, trying to keep his composure. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly. When the session ended, the crowd moved around him like a current, reporters rushing forward, cameras flashing, voices calling his name. But he barely heard them. The mother of the defendant hugged him tightly, whispering, "You gave us our lives back." He nodded, his voice barely more than a whisper. "That's all I wanted." Outside, the sun was bright and warm. He stood on the courthouse steps again, looking out at the city below. The same steps where he had once been ridiculed and doubted were now filled with people cheering, clapping, calling his name. But he didn't bask in it. He just smiled quietly and looked up at the sky, clear and open, just like his future. For the first time, he felt certain of where he belonged. Not just in that courtroom, but in the world beyond it, where truth, courage, and heart still meant something. When Ethan woke up the next morning, the world felt strangely still. The storm of the courtroom was over, but echoes of it lingered in his mind. He lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to grasp what had really happened the day before. The case that had consumed his life for weeks was finished. The verdict had been in his favor. Justice had been served. Yet instead of excitement, he felt a deep, quiet calm, the kind that only comes when something much bigger than victory has taken place. He got up slowly, moving through his small apartment in silence. The city outside was alive as always. Car horns, morning chatter, the hum of buses. But he felt detached from it, still carrying the weight of all that had unfolded. On the table sat the same old folder he'd carried everywhere. It was frayed at the edges, full of notes, photographs, and scribbled ideas. The sight of it made him smile. That folder had been his companion through it all, his shield, his weapon, and, in some strange way, his story. His phone buzzed. Dozens of messages filled the screen. Reporters, classmates, strangers who had seen the trial online. Some called him an inspiration. Others just wanted to know how a teenager had managed to outsmart seasoned lawyers. Ethan read a few of them but replied to none. He wasn't ready to be a headline. Not yet. Later that morning he took the bus downtown, the same route he'd taken every day to the courthouse. This time, though, the air around him felt lighter. The faces of strangers who recognized him on the bus smiled, some offering a quiet nod. He didn't crave the attention, but he appreciated the kindness. He had once walked those streets feeling invisible. Now people saw him, not as a child playing pretend, but as someone who had earned his place. When he reached the courthouse steps, he stopped. It was strange being there without the tension of the case pulling at him. The old stone building looked peaceful, almost majestic in the morning light. He climbed the steps slowly, his hand brushing along the cold railing, and for a brief moment, he remembered his first day there. The judge's laughter, the whispers from the crowd, the way his stomach twisted with fear. He smiled to himself. He had come a long way since then. Inside, the halls were quieter. Only a few clerks moved about, filing papers and chatting softly. As he passed one of them, a man called out, "Hey, you're the kid from that case last week, right? The one everyone's talking about?" Ethan turned, a little embarrassed. "I guess so." The man grinned. That was something. Never seen anyone handle pressure like that. "You've got a future here, kid." "Thank you," Ethan said sincerely. He walked toward the empty courtroom, now silent and still. The same wooden benches that had once been packed with curious faces now stood empty. The sunlight slanted through the high windows, dust floating in the air. He stood at the same table where he had fought so hard for the truth, running his hand along its surface. The silence felt sacred. He took a seat, closing his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the echo of the judge's voice, the shuffle of papers, the sound of his own heart beating too fast. But what stood out most was not the noise. It was the silence that followed the verdict. That silence had been filled with something powerful. Understanding, respect, maybe even redemption. A soft knock broke his thoughts. He looked up to see the judge standing in the doorway, not in her robe this time, but in a simple gray coat. She gave a faint smile. "I thought I might find you here." Ethan stood immediately. "Your Honor, it's all right," she said kindly, walking closer. "No need for formalities today. I just came to say thank you." "Thank me?" he asked, surprised. She nodded. "For reminding this court what justice should feel like. You brought something rare into this room. Honesty without arrogance, courage without ego. Not many lawyers manage that, let alone someone your age." Ethan felt his throat tighten. "I just wanted the truth to be heard." "And it was," she said softly. "You did well, Ethan. You should be proud." He hesitated before speaking again. Do you think I really belong here? In this world?" The judge's smile deepened. "If anyone belongs here, it's someone who asks that question. The moment you stop caring whether you belong, you've lost what makes you worthy of standing in front of this bench. Keep that humility and you'll go far." He nodded slowly, taking in her words. "Thank you, Your Honor, for giving me a chance when no one else would." She gave a gentle nod. It wasn't charity. It was earned. And for what it's worth, I hope you keep fighting. Not just in court, but in life. The world needs people who still believe in right and wrong. With that, she turned and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced back. "Oh, and Ethan, I meant what I said. I expect to see your name on that bar list one day." Then she left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Ethan stood there for a long time after she was gone. The sunlight had shifted, casting warm gold across the courtroom floor. He picked up his folder one last time and walked out slowly, the echo of his shoes the only sound in the vast hall. Outside, he found the same bench where he had waited so many times before. He sat down, looking at the world moving around him, people laughing, rushing to work, living their ordinary lives. For the first time, he felt like part of it, not above it, not apart from it, just part of it. His thoughts drifted to the family he'd helped. He'd received a message from them that morning. A simple thank you, a promise that they'd never forget what he'd done. He didn't need more than that. Knowing they were free, that their names were cleared, that justice had finally worked. That was enough. A young law student approached him nervously, holding a notebook. "Excuse me," she said. "You're Ethan Walker, right? I just wanted to say you inspired me. I watched your closing argument online. It made me believe that the system can still be good." Ethan smiled. "It can be," he said gently. But only if people like you keep it honest. She grinned shyly before hurrying off, leaving him alone again. He watched her go, feeling something warm rise in his chest. Maybe this was how change started, not with big speeches or dramatic victories, but with quiet moments that reached people one by one. As the sun began to set, painting the courthouse in shades of orange and pink, Ethan stood. He took one last look at the building that had tested him, shaped him, and in many ways defined him. Then he walked down the steps, not as the boy who had once been ridiculed, but as the young man who had stood his ground. Life moved on. Weeks passed. The story of the teenage attorney spread far beyond the city. Some called it a miracle, others a fluke. But Ethan didn't care what they called it. He kept studying, kept learning, kept working quietly behind the scenes. He knew the path ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be bigger courts, tougher opponents, and harder truths to face. But he was ready. Every morning he passed by the courthouse on his way to the library, and every time he looked up at those tall stone walls and smiled. It wasn't pride he felt, and it was gratitude. Gratitude for the journey, the lessons, and the people who had believed when no one else did. Years later, when his name finally appeared on the list of admitted attorneys, he went back to that same courtroom. The same judge, now older, smiled when she saw him enter. "I knew you'd make it," she said simply. He laughed softly. "You were right, Your Honor." And as he stood there, surrounded by the familiar scent of old wood and quiet justice, Ethan realized that what began as one boy's fight to be heard had become something greater, a reminder that truth, no matter how small the voice behind it, always finds a way to stand tall.